During his explanation of his 5 ways of proving the existence of God in his Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas writes the following, quote, "The second way is from the nature of efficient cause. In the world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God." End of quote. Many things need to be understood before appreciating the depth of this argument. First, what does St. Thomas mean by the term efficient causality? As we may recall from Lecture 4, this is a concept Aquinas takes from Aristotle, and its meaning is quite straightforward. An efficient cause is that which brings something into existence. Hence, the efficient causes of the microphone into which I'm speaking are the designers, machines, and technicians that manufactured the microphone. The efficient cause of the table at which you might be sitting is probably a carpenter and his assistants. The efficient cause of the tree outside your window was most likely some other tree from which came a seed that implanted into the ground and that grew into the tree that you see right now. In fact, the efficient cause of any organism, including you and me, is that organism's parent or parents. Thus understood, the efficient cause is not the same thing as that out of which a thing is made, such as the wood of the table, or the purpose for which a thing is made. These aspects of a thing we might remember, Aristotle and St. Thomas calls the material and final causes. The efficient cause, then, is most closely related to what we mean when we use the word cause in English, that which brings something else into existence. So what about St. Thomas's conclusion that there must be a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God? This conclusion is essentially derived from 2 premises in the argument. Premise 1, nothing can be the efficient cause of itself, and premise 2, in a series of efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity. If these 2 statements are true, it necessarily follows that there exists some first cause, which people who believe in God recognize as the object of their belief. Therefore, in order to understand the argument, we must examine closely the 2 premises on which it rests. Let's begin with the first. Why does Thomas Aquinas find it so obvious that nothing can be its own efficient cause? His words on this are quite strong. Not only is there no case known in which something is its own efficient cause, but such self-causation is not even possible. In other words, the reason we don't see things causing themselves to exist as their own efficient causes is not because doing so is exceedingly difficult or rare, like the natural conception of quadruplets, but because it is inherently impossible. As St. Thomas says, to do so would mean that something would have to exist prior to itself, which would mean that it would have to exist before it existed. This, in turn, would mean that it would have to both exist and not exist at the same time, which is self-evidently impossible. At this point, someone unfamiliar with the argument is likely to raise an objection. Has not St. Thomas just contradicted himself in a fairly obvious way? As we've seen, the entire argument rests upon the premise that nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. Nothing, in other words, can be its own efficient cause. If this means that everything must be caused by something else, how can St. Thomas conclude the argument by proposing God, the first cause, as an exception to this rule? If the rule admits of exceptions, why can't there be other exceptions? And if there are other exceptions, isn't the whole argument based on a rather flimsy foundation? But a careful look at the argument reveals that this contradiction is only apparent, and based on a caricature of St. Thomas's reasoning. Thomas Aquinas is not making the following argument that there must be a first cause because A, everything has a cause, B, the chain of causes cannot go back to infinity. This would indeed be an incoherent argument, because the conclusion directly contradicts the first premise. If we look again, though, we can see that the first premise of St. Thomas's argument is not that everything has a cause for its existence. It is rather that nothing causes itself to exist. This is quite different. Of course, one might still object that the conclusion is inconsistent with even this premise. Isn't St. Thomas more or less saying that, whereas everything else is caused by another, God causes himself to exist? Actually, he's not. According to St. Thomas, God is not caused to exist by anything, including himself. That's precisely what it means to say that he is the first cause. A first cause is, by definition, an uncaused cause. It's not something that somehow conjures itself into existence or pulls itself out of a hat. That would be, as we've seen, absurd. An uncaused cause, on the other hand, is necessary to explain the chain of causes that we see in front of us. Even if we have no direct experience of it, we can reason back to its existence based on what we do experience. What, though, about the second premise, that a series of efficient causes cannot go back to infinity? As you may remember from the last lecture, a version of this same premise appeared in the argument from motion, Aquinas' first argument for God's existence. In this argument, as with that one, Aquinas is not saying that the universe must have had a beginning. Rather, he is saying that an infinite regress of causes is not sufficient to explain the series of causes we witness today. Remember that just as an infinitely long series of train cars does not explain why the train is moving, an infinitely long series of causes and things caused does not explain why there is such a series in the first place. As we saw before, Aquinas acknowledges that whether the universe had some absolute beginning in time is not a question that philosophy is capable of answering. But what philosophy can establish is that, beginningless or not, the universe still must have a first cause, just as it must have a first mover. This point becomes even stronger and clearer if we consider the third way, the third argument for God's existence, outlined by St. Thomas. The following is that argument as it's laid out in the Summa Theologiae. Quote, "The third way is taken from possibility and necessity, and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. But it is impossible for these always to exist. For that which is possible not to be, at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus even now nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. And now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things, which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proven in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. End of quote. To appreciate the force of this argument, it's important first to understand the distinction upon which it's based, namely that between the necessary and the possible. In St. Thomas's philosophical language, something that is necessarily true is something that cannot be false under any conditions. Thus understood, the following three statements would be necessarily true, or true of necessity. 2 + 2 = 4, a square has 4 sides, and a whole is greater than any of its parts. Another way of describing these statements is to say that they are true by their terms. What this means is simply that one automatically sees that they must be true the moment one comprehends the meaning of the terms 2, 4, equals, square, side, whole, or part. 2 + 2 must equal 4. Nothing can change that. Regardless if the universe in which we lived was radically different, 2 + 2 would still equal 4, and a whole would still be greater than any of its parts. By contrast, we may also speak of truths that are merely possible or contingent. These would be truths that are no less true than necessary truths, but which do not have to be true in the same way. Consider the following examples. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. The walls in my living room are white. I am 6 foot 4 inches tall. These three contingently true statements are, again, no less true than the first three necessarily true statements. They are true, however, in a different way. Unlike the first set, they do not have to be true. In other words, these statements could be rendered false if conditions were different. There could come a day when Washington, D.C. is not the capital of the United States, and of course it wasn't always so. There could easily come a day when the walls in my living room are not white. And there could easily come a day, as there have been days in the past, in which I am not 6 feet 4 inches tall. Another way to think of these statements is that their falsehood is logically possible. Unlike the case with necessary truths, denying them does not involve a logical contradiction. This, in fact, is all that's required for a true statement to fall into this category of contingent truths. Hence, the seemingly necessary statement, "I cannot walk through walls," is actually not a necessary truth. Granted that walking through walls is not possible at the present moment, it could be possible if conditions were different, such as the laws of physics. Walking through walls is, in other words, physically impossible, but not logically impossible. What's logically impossible, for example, would be to walk through a wall and not walk through a wall at the same time. To sum up, therefore, a contingent truth is expressed by any statement that is true, but does not have to be true of logical necessity, or by the very definition of the terms involved. If we consider the nature of contingent truths more carefully, we notice something striking that they all have in common. In addition to having the logical possibility of being false, they also have explanations for why they are true. Consider the three examples that I gave earlier. There is an historical and political explanation as to how Washington, D.C. became the U.S. capital. There's a personal explanation as to how the walls in my living room came to be white. There's a physical and genealogical explanation as to how I became 6 foot 4 inches. The same is the case for any contingent truth you can think of. There is a computer in my office. It's raining outside. The earth revolves around the sun. Frozen waffles exist. All of these true statements have explanations precisely because they don't have to be true. In other words, the very fact that they don't have to be true, but are true, means that there must be some reason as to why they are true. This appears to belong to the very nature of contingency. By contrast, necessary truths never have explanations of this kind. It makes no sense to explain how 2 plus 2 came to equal 4. That's just what 2 plus 2 equals. It makes no sense to explain how wholes became greater than their parts. That's just what a whole is. It makes no sense to explain how squares came to have 4 sides. That's just the definition of a square. Clearly, for someone to attempt to provide an explanation of necessary truths is to misunderstand what a necessary truth is. They simply need no explanation. We now move on to the next stage of the argument. As St. Thomas would tell us, just as it makes sense to speak of contingently true statements, it also makes sense to speak of contingent things, or beings. This, in fact, does not require much of a leap. If a contingent truth is one that could possibly be false, a contingent being is simply one that could possibly not be. This means that everything we directly experience with our senses falls into the category of contingent beings. The book you might now be holding, the chair in which you're sitting, your mother, your father, even you yourself, are all contingent beings because none of them have to exist. This would also mean that everything from the tiniest molecule to the most distant galaxy are also contingent beings. They do not have to exist either. Sure, such things might be necessary for some effect. A distant galaxy might be physically necessary, for example, in the formation of our own galaxy. But this doesn't mean that it's not a contingent thing. One can conceive, in other words, of a logically possible state of affairs in which that galaxy does not exist. With these preliminary considerations having been made, we are now in a position to consider St. Thomas's third argument for God's existence. We may reconstruct it as follows. Premise 1. Everything that exists contingently has some explanation for its existence outside itself. Premise 2. The material universe exists contingently. Premise 3. Therefore, the material universe has an explanation outside of itself. Premise 4. If the material universe has an explanation outside of itself, that explanation must be a necessary being, or God. Conclusion: therefore, the explanation of the universe is a necessary being, or God. We must first observe that the argument is logically valid. In other words, the conclusion follows from the premises in such a way that, if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. More specifically, we might observe that premise 3 follows necessarily from premises 1 and 2. Furthermore, the conclusion follows directly from premises 3 and 4. Since premise 3 and the conclusion, therefore, are simply the logical derivatives of the other premises, it means that the only premises requiring defense are 1, 2, and 4. Let's begin with 1. As St. Thomas argues, just as all contingent truths must have explanations for why they are true, all contingent things or beings must likewise have explanations as to why they exist. The chair on which you're sitting exists, among other reasons, because it was manufactured by a factory in order to be sold. The book you're holding exists, among other reasons, because the author had some things he wanted to say in print. I exist because my mother and father fell in love, got married, and decided to have children. Some distant galaxy exists, finally, because the expansion of the universe and the laws of physics caused a galaxy to form at a particular time and place. In short, human experience universally confirms that anything which does not have to exist, but does exist, must have some explanation as to why it exists. Intuitively, this just seems to be true, even when we have no idea what the explanation for a particular thing is. Even if an astronomer has no idea why a distant galaxy exists, it would be foolish for that astronomer to conclude, or even to entertain, that its existence might actually just have no explanation whatsoever. Even if a physician has no idea how a patient contracted a certain disease, it would be irrational to speculate that the disease's presence in a body likewise has no explanation at all. Why would this be irrational? For the simple reason that neither the disease nor the galaxy have to exist. The fact that they nonetheless do exist requires an explanation. This is essentially the claim of proposition or premise 1. Because it is universally verified by experience and never falsified, it is an extremely difficult premise to deny. What about premise 2? Perhaps we should begin by clarifying the key term material universe. This does not simply mean the universe that is visible with the telescope, the microscope, or the naked eye. It is also not necessarily limited to the universe that science tells us is the product of the Big Bang. It means quite simply the totality of all matter and energy. To the degree that time and space do not exist without matter, moreover, it would also include time and space. Once we understand the material universe in this sense, we're in a position to see just how compelling the claim of premise 2 is. The material universe is contingent, which means that it does not necessarily exist. At first, this claim might strike one as odd. But of course, someone will object, the universe is necessary. It's necessary for all kinds of things. We couldn't even raise the question as to the existence of God if there was no universe, because we wouldn't even be here. These claims are true, to be sure, but completely beside the point. Remember that claiming something is a necessary being does not mean that its existence is necessary for something else. As we saw, a proposition that is necessarily true cannot be false. Likewise, a being that necessarily exists cannot not be. So while it's perfectly obvious that the universe's existence is necessary for all kinds of things, it's patently false that the universe exists of necessity in and of itself. In fact, no material thing of necessity exists in and of itself. Whatever material thing of which one thinks, it's perfectly consistent to imagine a universe without that thing. And since the universe, as defined by this argument, is nothing more than the totality of all matter, it's perfectly obvious that that universe as a whole does not have to exist. Its non-existence, however difficult to imagine, implies no contradiction or logically impossible state of affairs. Let's finally turn to premise 4, which appears to be the most controversial. If the material universe has an explanation outside of itself, that explanation must be a necessary being, or God. Let's consider for a moment whether the explanation of the material universe is something contingent or even material. Immediately, one should see that this would be no explanation at all, since a material being, while possibly explaining the existence of a great many things in the universe, would still be part of the universe requiring explanation. Remember that our definition of the universe is just the totality of all time, space, matter, and energy, which would include any other universes beyond the products of the Big Bang. Even moreover, if the explanation of the universe was not material, it would still require an explanation, so long as it were a contingent being, since, as we noticed, it belongs to the very essence of a contingent being to require an explanation. If the explanation required is some other contingent being, then that too would require an explanation, and so on and so on. Ultimately, the only way to provide the explanation that the universe's contingency requires is to admit the existence of a being whose existence is not contingent, but necessary. Unlike any contingent being, whether material or immaterial, a necessary being would finally provide an explanation for the universe while requiring no explanation itself. Not needing an explanation, as we've seen, is part of what it means for something to exist necessarily. To boil down the argument to its barest bones, therefore, one might say the following: the universe does not have to exist, but it does exist, and therefore there must be some explanation as to why it exists. That explanation can in no way be anything contingent. Therefore, it must be something necessary, a necessary being.